Hi Roland, we're doing a quick sound check. Can you hear us? Hi Roland, can you hear us? Hi, Roland. Checking to hear whether, well, you can hear us. Is he on the call? Roland? I don't see him on the bottom. He's not on the call. Just message. Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you for joining us, everyone. We just need a minute to make sure our colleague can join. He's joining remotely, so we're just making sure that he's able to be on.
Why did you try calling him? It's not connecting.
Hey, will you just put this weekend and check this Hey, can we have the clicker as well, please? Hi everyone, so as we wait, maybe since we have a captive audience, it would be great to know who's in the room, and if you'd be open to introducing yourselves or why you're interested in the session. We'd be happy to hear a little bit about your backgrounds as we get started. We would love to hear from who's in the room, and if you'd like to volunteer an introduction, that would be great. No pressure. Fantastic.
Our main office in Africa is in Ghana, and we're very interested in data stewardship. We have a data governance team within PBI, and we have a very important focus on decarbonized data protection framework across the country. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thanks so much. Anyone else would like to introduce?
Hi,
Fantastic. Yeah, we've had a conversation with Nima from Policy as well on data stewardship. It's good to see you in the room. Thank you for coming. Anyone else would like to? Hi.
Hi, my name is Mia Nava. I'm the Senior Research Analyst at the Caribbean Telecommunications Union. I'm very interested in stewardship and data governance generally, but we want to develop ICT indicators specific to the Caribbean region.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here. Hi.
Hello, I'm Dorothy Mukasa. I work with the N1 Development Uganda, and I'm interested in data governance. We convene the annual Services Symposium Africa, where we convene different data regulators and different stakeholders. Let's discuss the prevention and the policy.
Fantastic. Really important work. Hi.
We're working on the national data governance. That's why I joined this session.
Thank you for joining. Keen to hear your insights as well. Wonderful. We're just doing short introductions as we pull up our presentation. We're having some technical issues, but we would love to know who else is in the room. Hi. Fantastic. Thanks so much. All right, any last introductions? If you'd like to introduce yourself, no pressure. Hi.
Open Data African Francophone Conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Anyone
Yes,
else?
yes. Hi, my name is Tijani Benjama. I am the chair of the MAG of the North African IGF.
Wonderful to have you.
Contrast to the three ones.
Perfect. All right, we're going to get started in just a minute. Our apologies. We had a colleague joining remotely, but it seems like he's unable to be on video today with us. Sorry about that. Just to repeat, I'm sorry, we had a colleague who was meant to be on joining us on Zoom, but is unable to make it or is having technical difficulties. So that's the reason for the delay. But we are really thrilled to have you in the room with us. Thank you for taking the time. I know it's been a long day, so we appreciate you stopping by for this evening session. And we're going to get started in just about a minute or so as soon as we have the slides up. I also wanted to mention that we are keen to sort of keep this dialogue open and would love to hear your perspectives and expertise. I think you come from various backgrounds, and so we'd love to see how we can, collaborate with you in the future, or see how we can, enmesh these insights from today also in the work that you carry out in your respective jurisdictions. So thank you for being here, and we hopefully will have an interesting discussion. Also wanted to flag that we want to keep this as interactive as possible, so we will be presenting case studies as well as insights. But at any point, if you would like any clarification, we would love to hear from you and want to keep this as open-ended as possible. So is it okay if I ask you to change to the next slide? Okay, perfect. Thanks. All right. Thank you again for being here, everyone. We're going to get started. So I'm really grateful to be joined by my two colleagues today, Amrita Nanda from Apti Institute, which is where I work, as well as Kito Shilongo from Research ICT Africa. Unfortunately, we don't have Roland Banya on call, but he has also participated in putting together this material. So I'll start out with a quick overview of what we'll be discussing today. So if you can go to the next slide. So very broadly, we'll do a quick introduction to our organizations, talk about the challenges we're seeing in the way that data is collected and governed in the data economy today, touch on a few case studies where we're seeing innovation in the way data is being collected, governed, what the implications are for the policy environment, as well as where participation fits in. And then we do have a section for resources that if we do have time, we'll get into. Otherwise, we'll share this deck with you and we'll hopefully be able to take forward the conversation on that front. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions and discussion towards the end. Wonderful. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague to introduce Apti.
Hi everyone, I'm Amrita. Hopefully a few of you know of Apti Institute. I see a few familiar faces in the room. But we're essentially a public research organization. We're based in Bangalore in India, and we work on everything at the intersection of technology and society with a focus on how people actually negotiate access, inclusion, and sort of look at this through two lenses, both the online and the offline. So the team that Soha and I work primarily on, the Data Economy Lab, looks more at policy making, technology development, the ways in which communities are actually negotiating with digital interventions, or how they're negotiating with an increasingly datafied world. The second vertical, the Digital Public Lab, looks at offline questions of access. So what does last mile access look like for communities, and what is the offline infrastructure needed for everyone to sort of be included in an increasingly datafied world? I'll hand over to Quito then to introduce Research ICT Africa's work a little bit.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I know it's the last session and everyone's kind of having a brain fog, but we really appreciate it. I'm Kito Shilongo from Research ICT Africa, and we are a think tank in Africa, and we conduct multidisciplinary research on the digital governance, policy, and regulation. And we do this with the intention of facilitating evidence-based and informed policy. Our research is also public interest, mainly on the digital economy and also society and how society responds to it. We aim to contribute to digital equality and data justice, which is a very important part of this presentation and this session today. And for the session today, we are presenting our work under the Africa Just AI project. And we have two main themes which we are looking at, and those are beneficial AI and sustainable development, and as well as coming up with collective and participative governance frameworks with the intention of contributing to data justice. We will explain what data justice is throughout this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Quito. Next slide, please. All right, so I think we've all collectively, come to IGF with the understanding that there are a few things that we need to solve in the room. And I think a few of these challenges we highlight today as being the lack of transparency and accountability. So a lot of data is collected, but we don't have an idea of what that looks like as individuals, let alone as communities. So it's extremely hard for us to be able to know what data is collected and what value may come from this data. The second challenge is that we don't really participate in questions around data collection as at that individual or community level. So it leaves us with little option of how to collaborate or how to connect with other people, build solidarities around data, learn how we can generate collective or shared value, because often the value of data is actually relational. It isn't just sort of siloed, and the internet or the sort of digital processes at the moment tend to silo us as individuals in this ecosystem. The last issue is that often a lot of this data is controlled and held by certain entities. It's often larger corporations, it could be even state entities, where they're sort of unsure of how to release this information or don't have the incentive to release this information. And in the case that they do, it becomes extremely hard for others to use it. So you run into other challenges with respect to how to generate value from this data at an open level. So we see a few opportunities that arise from these challenges. One, that there are opportunities for individuals to play a bigger part in the way that data is collected as well as governed. And we see this happening through stewardship, which we'll talk about very soon. The other is thinking about how we can collaborate with multiple entities, whether it's state-led, whether it is the private sector, whether it is civil society, important to have in the room and to build data collaborations with. And the last is also how we can think about these levels of technology, both at an online as well as an offline level. So as we're transitioning to a digitized world, how do we also have processes that are offline that are running in parallel to ensure that things like access are not sort of assumed for those who don't have access to sort of digital infrastructures and technologies. So it is on this basis, if you can go to the next slide. It's on this basis that we believe that a new, just, and fair contract for data is required. And we see data stewardship, which is an umbrella term you'll hear us unpack very soon, as being at the heart of this. And we essentially believe that stewardship can help facilitate a lot of these larger themes around user agency and participation, around transparency, in terms of safeguarding digital rights when it comes to privacy, cybersecurity, etc., as well as unlocking instrumental value. So these are big promises, but we'll jump into how these are rooted in the framework of data justice, and my colleague Quito will take that.
Okay, so I think a lot of discussions about data is that, we want to unlock the value of data. Specifically in Africa, for instance, there's, a lot of people coming up with solutions or like frameworks and how people can use data to provide like social solutions, but also like economic solutions. And data justice is one of those paradigms which facilitates it. And of course, we want to take a step back and say that, hey, we may have data, but then this data is also, is rooted in discrimination, rooted in structural and systematic inequalities, as well as also keeping in mind that it furthers discrimination online and offline. And for this concept has experts have developed three principles which deal with invisibility and visibility of data subjects or data communities. It also looks at how communities engage with technology. So when you build this technology which is based on these data, how do communities engage, but also considering how they disengage communities as well. It also looks at discrimination and how to facilitate and make sure that it is not it is anti-discriminatory. And of course, a leading expert in data justice envisions that data justice promotes fairness in the way people are made visible, represented, and treated as a result of their production of digital data. And this is necessary to determine ethical pathways through a datifying world. And so this is seen, or we see data stewardship as a means to data justice. I'll hand over to Amrita, who will talk about data stewardship.
So just to give a little bit of a primer on how we see stewardship as a framework, we'll play part of a sort of introductory video that we have. These are all resources you can also find on our website. Always ask us to send over. Can we go ahead and play the link? It should open up in YouTube.
Are there any questions that you have as we
Yeah.
this link? I know this is a sort of more esoteric concept at the moment, and we're hoping the case studies will drive home what we mean by data stewardship. And the video also aims to kind of visualize where data stewards will be positioned in the sort of ecosystem of data sharing. But while we do have a moment, are there any questions you might have? What we mean by any of these terms, or sort of how we're envisioning data stewardship? This is just a bit of a check-in point.
Maybe we can just talk through it.
We can talk through it if it doesn't work. Let us know. If it's not working, we can proceed. Yeah?
Try to. Okay, we'll give it a minute. Oh, yeah, I didn't realize. Maybe some of our attendees online through the Zoom links have questions or something they want to put in the chat. I don't know how we see it. Yeah. All right, so we'll make sure to share the video later. But essentially, given a lot of the inequities that Suha and Kito have both already outlined, and the broader vision of increasing data justice and a more sort of fair and equitable data economy, we envision data stewards as trusted intermediaries in between. We can go to the next slide as well. In between users, fiduciaries, and data requesters. Data stewards can look in many different ways, and we'll talk a little bit about what kind of frameworks we've seen. But essentially, they can play a host of roles. The roles we see here are not exhaustive. They're also not always combined within the same steward. We could sort of picture them as both technical and structural. So from the technical lens, stewards can play the role of increasing data literacy, even building standards and frameworks for data use, playing the role of an analytical layer, allowing communities to understand their data better. Excuse me. From the sort of structural lens, and this is a very important one that we'll be focusing on in this presentation especially, is the way that data stewards can facilitate participation. So increasing the agency and autonomy of individuals in negotiating with how their data is used, how it's processed, or even having greater visibility over it. Finally, they can also offer grievance and redressal mechanisms that typically we are now seeing exist within privacy laws and frameworks, but may not always be actionized on ground in the way that we would want them to. Can go to the next slide. The next slide. So as we've been doing this research over the past couple of years, this has been a lot of primary research by speaking to data stewards or practitioners of stewardship, but also secondary research. We've sort of landed on what the ecosystem perhaps needs to look like to support these efforts, to support, in general, more human-centric data governance. Then what we found is that while at the top layer are domestic international regulations and sort of policy measures that are typically that are state efforts, that needs to be married with the sort of bottom-up understanding that ecosystem enablers, which I think is a part that you can't see over the captions, but ecosystem enablers being the technologists, the builders, the people who are actually working with technology on a daily basis. And the sort of second layer of this is the philanthropies, the people who are able to fund research and fund initiatives like this, where communities are unable to. So what you see here is sort of a constellation of the taxonomy that we have so far of the kinds of models we've seen. They all differ in their design choices, the ways in which and the degrees to which they encourage participation, and the kind of benefits that they're geared to. So the way we see it, there is no sort of one size fits all for either of these models. For different data types, for different sectors, and definitely for different jurisdictions, different models work in combination. So we've been sort of focusing on climate environmental data as a sector, and so I will talk a bit more about that.
All right, so you've heard from Amrita that we've seen this sort of constellation, data cooperatives, exchanges. Many of these terms are familiar to all of us in the room, I imagine. But we've been focusing on how this aligns or applies to the collection of data, collection of environmental data or data that has to do with sustainable development. It's something that we've all had to collectivize around, and it's important for us to determine what the different model types are and what the approaches may be as we think of this for policymaking efforts and for kind of reconciling data from different players and from different sources. So we'll go on and we'll talk about a few different approaches, but before that I want to talk about participation a little bit more. So you've heard us say participation a few times, and we see that this can vary across thinking about how this can be designed. And so as you see on screen, there's a few different layers or levels to participation, right? So depending on who the audience is, who the beneficiary community may be, you may be engaging with them at various different points. So informing them of how data is being governed, to being able to empower them with actually taking decisions on who data is shared with and for what purpose. So this can range, and we also cover a few different case studies where you see that diversity in participation. But it's important to consider this slide of this sort of ladder of participation, because as you're designing, whether it's stewardship or data collection efforts, you will have different entities, whether they're beneficiaries or organizations, that can engage or participate at various points, right? And may have access constraints, they may have constraints with respect to their own data and their digital literacy, as well as their incentive to participate. So not all of us actually want to engage with questions around our data. Maybe we want someone to advocate on our behalf. So as we keep this in mind, we want to go through a few different case studies. Next slide, please. Awesome. So the first is a high level of participation. So we see this in the context of agriculture. This is a project that we're actually running along with two other organizations. So the 17 Rooms project funded by Brookings Institution, as well as with a cooperative, so an agricultural cooperative based in India, referred to as MECA, and this falls under the broader Self-Employed Women's Association, or SEWA. And what the sort of central point of question or the point of research has been, what's sort of the value of generating a data layer on top of an existing cooperative? So many of us are familiar with cooperative structures, how they exist in sort of offline settings. We were asking, is there value in actually, placing a data layer on top and helping pool data that the cooperative generates, and then being able to deliver these insights back to the women who are part of this cooperative. And so we had a few different questions that we asked. One was around the actual governance of the data. So how would women want to be involved in this? Are there existing structures around decision-making that exist within the cooperative that can be taken advantage of? What do those look like? The second question is the incentive to participate. Is there value that women see in being able to pool this data together? Do they see any benefits immediately, or how can they be shown this value if it exists? And the third is the data itself. So what data can be collected from women, the activities that they generate, or from the cooperative itself and the running of the cooperative? And with respect to that, what is the technology that needs to sort of power these decisions or power the governance of this data itself? And lastly, the question of capacity, right? We've mentioned data and digital literacy a lot, but when you're thinking about this specific group of people, what is the engagement that, for example, women farmers need from a sort of capacity building standpoint to better understand how data may be able to be beneficial for them, and how do they relate to data in their own terms? And so we've seen that there are a few learnings around this. So when we interviewed women and our colleagues went out onto the field, there's a few ways in which data or pooled data can actually be delivered back to these women. The first is that it actually enhances their credit worthiness because there is a foundation or layer of data that becomes available to share with financial institutions. The second is that once they have this information or insights from the cooperative itself, they may be able to scale the actual activity of the cooperative and generate greater profits. The third is that there's sort of just greater autonomy. They have visibility into sort of the ongoings of the cooperative itself, and they're able to take better decisions on that basis. As well. So that is the cooperative structure, which is a high level of participation. As Amrita described, these exist offline. So this is really looking at how this can be translated into an online setting. And there's some great opportunities we're seeing in this space. The second model, if you can go to the next slide, is a data collaborative, and it speaks to the broader point of needing multiple stakeholders to come together. So data collaboratives are often organized on the basis of a shared mission or a purpose. So in this sense, this data collaborative brought together stakeholders from the public sector as well as from the private sector. We see research institutions being involved in this, as well as a multilateral organization, so that's the UNDP. And what they ended up creating as a result of this collaboration was a digital public good. So as you see on screen, there's a few screenshots of what that looks like, and it's actually called the Data for Climate Resilient Agriculture platform. And we're happy to share sort of resources on this as well. But it's interesting because it compiles existing open data, so geospatial data, and they also worked with the governments to be able to pool data sets that they possess and actually visualize them and make them accessible. So there's various ways and toggles that you can actually customize to see different views at a regional level, but also at a global level. What's interesting about this kind of platform is that you can see insights that are at a micro level, so you can really toggle with the filters and look at different indicators or indices, but you can also look at broader historical trends and patterns, which is really important for sort of foresight or anticipatory policymaking as we go forward. The other important element of creating these digital public goods is that they can be customizable. So in this instance, you're seeing this represented in the state of Telangana in India. But if you were to partner or create a data collaborative with a government, for instance, in Cambodia or in Tunisia, then you're able to pool data that exists from an open source as well as from a public source and get some really interesting insights that come out of this. And going forward, there's a few other models that my colleagues will also speak to.
Go to the next slide. Perfect. Thanks, Sua. So this next case study is, I think, really testament to how different types of stewardship models or different types of intermediaries can come together to create that sort of larger purpose. We have two examples here. One is of SafetyPin, which is a platform, a technology platform that was launched in India, but now in India in a city called Pune, but now functions in a number of cities across the world. In Kenya, in Colombia. But essentially what the app enables users to do is to audit public spaces themselves, targeted specifically at women and girls, to be able to develop safety scores for these public spaces. What's especially interesting, and I think we missed that screenshot, is that the kind of parameters used on the app actually speak to a lot of things that we as women contend with when deciding whether a public space is safe for us or not, but aren't often quantifiable or aren't something that we're able to aggregate and think about, like lighting, openness, visibility, how many women do we see in the area, so the gender division. There's also a sort of second part to this app, which is called SafetyPin Night, which actually collects visual data every 30 meters using an IoT camera that is attached to a vehicle. For this, there's also been partnerships with the private and public sector within SafetyPin. So why this is interesting is because when combined with the Indian Urban Data Exchange, which is an open source aggregator for urban data and specifically for mobility data, data from a source like SafetyPin is really well contextualized by other mobility data. It's also, the IUDX serves to come to sort of build standards and ensure that data inputted from many sources, not just something like a safety pin, is standardized, is readable, and then in turn usable by third-party innovators, so whether those are startups looking to build citizen services, but also for urban governance decisions. So this data is then exchangeable between government departments, different state departments, and so for the users themselves, there's more diverse and sort of evidenced knowledge on how to navigate public spaces. This is particularly true for women, and it sort of creates this aggregated, standardized set of insights for policymakers to make better decisions as well. So this is one of the ways that we've seen two sort of different models come together, and a number of these examples exist throughout the data exchange as well. Keto will talk a little bit now on data cooperatives.
Okay, so I'm just going to speak to some examples from the African continent and specifically in Southern Africa. One of them is the Abalobi social enterprise digital platform, which was founded in 2015, and it connects fishers and buyers, people who fishermen and as well as people who buy fish, and it presents a suite of applications which helps fishers to track, manage, and sell their catches. And beyond that, it is also used as a advocacy tool to also to advocate for different policy interventions. So this platform is backed by a participatory action framework, and it aims to protect the rights of small-scale fishers in South Africa. If anyone is from Southern Africa here, the fishing industry works in the way that they are, they're fishing quotas, for instance, and most of the time, big enterprises are the ones who, have more rights and at the determinant of the small-scale fishers. And so this platform or these applications, we see that the stewardship model has three users: with the data contributors, which are the fishers, and everyone else who works with them. Abalobi is the data collector, and then there are data users, which span from universities, research facilities, as well as government, and specifically the Department of Agriculture and Forestry and Fishery. What we've seen with this project is that the kind of impact very much aligns with data justice tenets and principles, and one of them is that based on the data that is collected, the community, the fishermen, are able to have collective negotiation and bargaining. So they can use certain insights from the data that they collect to talk to different departments in the government. They can also advocate for their rights. So if they're fishing in a certain place and some sort of corporation, we've seen like a mining company come and want to extract or place an oil rig within the region that they fish, and they have the data to say that, hey, we have this place is beneficial to us, and we have the data that it's providing economic opportunities and benefits to us. It also we've also seen that other stakeholders can come and request for data, which also fuels into innovation. So third-party requester can ask for the insights, and based on the consent from the community, it is given to them to feed into any sort of innovation that they might have. And secondly, it also makes visible labor that is traditionally invisible. So we have seen that women, for instance, would assist. A lot of fishing activity happens, and you see, the fishermen in the sea, but then the women who are packing that fish, their work is very much invisible. And so they have a points-based system where, when someone, for instance, packs a box of fish or sells it to a local shop, those activities are recorded and tallied up, and they have some sort of a point system and remunerated for it, and they get data. The data is collected and they are remunerated because of the fact that they also get insights from it. to see how, how to trace how the supply chain works. They also empower communities with data. So these insights can help, the fishermen see, what are sustainable ways to catch fish, for instance, or sustainable places to catch fish, and also like improve on the supply chain in as a whole. And it's also safeguarding digital rights. It's beyond the traditional way of like just ticking a box and saying that we consent to it. They provide visual consent mechanisms, so they provide ways of, infographics and saying that this is how it works. They also have a very strong participatory data decision-making framework. They have a board, a not-for-profit board, that governs the way that the data on this platform is shared. Yeah. If anyone has questions at this point.
I realize we've gone through a lot of case studies in different sectors and different models. So just wondering if anyone has questions on any of what we've sort of talked through so far.
Yeah, I also want to preface that we talked about very different use cases, and I think the sources of data will also differ here, as well as the stakeholders involved. So we see that with data collaboratives, for instance, you have various stakeholders that can come together to create a technical infrastructure. We saw the a digital public good that was created for data and climate resilient agriculture. But you see the more small scale applications can really kind of extend down to helping farmers realize the value of their data, or fisher folk realize the value of their data. So I think the use cases for data stewardship can really also vary depending on the size or the extent of the problem you're looking to solve for, or the kind of data that needs to be collected. So I kind of wanted to preface that because I realize there are various interpretations of what data stewardship could mean. And also, as Amrita pointed out, we do have a legacy of understanding data stewardship very differently within organizations. So the framework we're presenting today really deals with things like the governance of data, as well as the more technical facets of how it can be safeguarded. So thinking through things like encryption, thinking through things like other processes like data minimization that we see from a policy standpoint. So it really encompasses a broader sort of realm of discussion around data governance, not just the technical safeguards, but also how we think about data at a human level in some ways, which is why the case studies we've chosen kind of highlight these more individual or community-oriented possibilities in some ways. So I wanted to pause here, and as Kito also described, this would be really interesting to also get your opinion on where you see this land in your respective jurisdictions, in your work. Data for policy is a huge buzzword today, so would be keen to see how this is being applied. So any questions? I'm happy to hand over the mic. I know we have another one around as well, but we'll use this to pause here. Or anyone online that would like to jump in as well. Hi.
Election or
sorry, I can't hear you. Could you maybe use the mic?
Yes, rapid again. I see your presentation, but my question is, do you apply or any pilot project into the election or maybe a political campaign about the data stewardship?
So we haven't personally looked at any data-led innovation around campaign information. I know that there's quite a bit that's been done around identity and access management, and I think that would feed into the sort of campaign process, but would be like one of the building blocks. So I think we're seeing in the broader conversation around digital infrastructure and digital public goods, how public sector as well as maybe private sector can create these products that link identity, create access, and also create these platforms for citizens to be able to interact with the state. So we're seeing stewards sort of fit into that broader, puzzle piece, but not with respect to elections specifically. Happy to take it offline as well and see if there's, new examples that we can pull from that might be able to address some of these concerns. Any other questions or any? Hi.
No, go ahead. Thank you. No, talking about what you just mentioned about the different uses of the word advocacy. Sorry, it's because I was going to talk about advocacy. Stewardship. I think that in the work that we've done, we've tried to talk about data stewardship, but to drive the conversation away from data governance, but at a country level. Not as much as an advocacy role of individuals going to like increase digital skills and the use of data in an individual, which I think is what the case studies represent. But then I'm wondering if we're using the word wrong, because what we're trying to do is to help governments move away from a concept of data governance, because I feel that that's very related to data sovereignty, and that comes along with all of this expansion of data localization measures that are impeding the sharing of data across borders. So we're trying to change the language from data governance to data stewardship to help governments understand that the important thing is to use data to extract value for social and economic value of data, but also share it with others.
Right.
But are we using the data stewardship word wrong then?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then if my colleagues would like to add on. That's a fascinating question, and I think a lot of the cases that we've chosen today, as you mentioned, really focus on the individual or community value question, and we haven't looked at the sort of possible uses cross-border in some sense. But I think the way that we think about stewardship is kind of overarching. We also are aiming to kind of push the envelope on data governance a little bit, because it ends up being very organizational specific or very state specific. And so yes, policies are important to consider as far as data privacy and data governance, but I think there are use cases for stewardship at an ecosystem level, which is what we're trying to push for. And the reason we chose sustainable development and environmental action is that I think it is cross-border in some sense. So the question around data for climate resilient agriculture is one that will have to be addressed by neighboring countries, by our global sort of collective in some sense as well. So I don't think we're defining it very differently. I do think it is maybe a result of some of the cases that we've proposed. I think there's also enormous value in looking at sort of global issues that we have to be able to contend with together, whether it's on issues like water management, whether it's issues like air pollution, all of these indicators. It's far more valuable to have this data shared amongst actors and amongst countries as well. So I don't think we're advocating for data localization in that respect either, but I do think we're envisioning it at a very similar level, but I will also leave my colleagues to jump in here.
I think I agree with you on the question of the definition, but I think through some of the research that we've done on what data localization can look like and whether that's really at odds with community value, for us one of the important questions was, what does stewardship look like for non-personal data versus personal data? What are the kinds of taxonomizations that different countries are going through or arriving at to be able to make cross-border data flows a reality? So I think that's where like the tension with data sovereignty comes in. But I think it might be also helpful. For example, we wouldn't see a cooperative sort of, or at least at this stage, engaging in cross-border data flows, but at the level of, say, thinking about open data mechanisms or what nationwide data exchanges can look like. That's where the sort of mindset or orientation of stewardship is something that is oriented towards public interest, public value, and finding ways to define that public value across different data types. That's maybe one way of transposing how we think about data stewardship to this sort of more international thinking.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think in Africa we also have the same kind of thinking, and the response of like trying to break down, data governance to like data steward and these different like tenants is because of that. When we were speaking about data governance, we've always I think people initially were talking about it from a national and also like very much pushing for data localization and data sovereignty, and like there's no value in like data that is like stored in your country. Like the value comes in how it's used. And then also now when we introduce the concept, and that's why we want to really like push this framework of justice to say that yes, data, you can have data, but like as well, like when you use it, it can further injustices for other people. And so like we're trying to like, I don't see harm in using data stewardship in that matter, and I think it points to the fact that policy frameworks on a national level and at a continental level should respond to what's on the ground. So data governance policy frameworks should help facilitate this collective or participatory ways of handling and processing data.
I think you had a question.
Okay, thank you very much. The session is very interesting, and I've learned a lot. Thanks so much once again. And now we are talking about data, but I think I'm a little bit confused, because to talk about the data, how many of our countries or population are value or knows about the data? What does data mean? You see, even if you come to Africa or in our country, if you tell them or if you talk about data, they don't care, because they have no value. What data leakage means, what data means. First, I think education should be there. I think after that also the government should do care for its citizen, for its country, about the data. So this is the main problem. Then after that, I think we can talk about stewards or other things. Otherwise, without educating our population, our government, for instance, let us take different NGOs, different NGOs. They have different human resources software. They use a cloud system. Most of them are in states, so they get employees' data, but the government doesn't take care. They doesn't care. So how are we talking about data stewardship without, teaching or creating awareness to our governments or our population? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I can start us off, but no, I mean, I think we definitely agree that the sort of first premise, the foundational layer, is data literacy, that kind of advocacy, and sort of even just diagnosing what can incentivize communities to think about data in this way, to think about their data rights in a more holistic manner, and whether also if communities in certain jurisdictions have the bandwidth to take on, say, a consent burden, or even the burden of sort of participating in a cooperative and doing that sort of decision making. So, I mean, I will preface this by saying that this is always an open question for us as well, and it's something that in the way that we envision stewards, and some of the examples we've seen as well, like with Megha, an existing data cooperative, so a situation where there are communities who already have a governance framework where decision making is allocated in a certain way, but how can we add a data layer to that and do exactly what you were talking about, sort of build that capacity, build literacy. I think also with the Abelobi example, on the way, for example, the way in which consent notices are given out, so rather than your traditional, not very effective, not all effective reams of text that you check box yes or no, to think about, to communicate consent through visual mechanisms. So think about how we sort of rethinking data literacy itself. Does it have to be a sort of a mammoth of capacity building, or can it be communicating with communities in a way that just requires less of that sort of upskilling and capacity building? Yeah.
I think that's, yeah, like Amrita said, it's a very important question. And I think for us, many times when we talk about data, we think about, that data is collected from all of us, and therefore we think that we should be, it's kind of like on us that everyone should know. We use computers, we don't know how, the motherboard or the CPU works. Sometimes I don't, and maybe the concept of data stewardship questions should communities know everything? Should people who are, subject to injustice know how these models work? Should they know the nitty-gritties of every, governance model? Do they have to know? Is that a burden that should be placed on them? And one of the, I think, these examples, for instance, they identify, I mean, we always talk about, especially in these circles, we talk about stakeholder and stakeholder responsibilities. So this is a new concept, we're all trying to learn. And so we're also identifying the different kinds of stakeholders and their responsibilities. And Apti has come up with a very interesting, playbook that identifies all these different stakeholders and their roles and their responsibilities. I don't think it should be, yes, data literacy is important, but towards who? Who's the end user? Who are those programs aimed at? And on the value, and I like that you said, the value of it. And I think you don't sometimes, for instance, there was another case study on Blue Forest project in Mozambique. The value is not in how it's happening, how the data is used. The value is perhaps also like when someone comes into a community and provides like this technology, and technology is, you know, beneficial, it's in gaining that trust from those communities and saying that, oh, okay, we've you have this data that comes from satellites or whatever. We have this knowledge that we've been living with these like forests or, you know, these trees for centuries, and we're collaborating. So this technology is designed with our needs, you know, in mind. And so it's not per se that, you know, they even have to understand data. It's just understanding how that came about. And I think stewardship contextualizes that and like puts responsibilities on everyone and like identifies who is involved and what is the outcome. I think that that's the most important, at least in the work that I've seen, just allowing like trust within communities and trust between different between different stakeholders.
I think that was really well put. I do have you know, additional point to add, but I want to open up the room to see if there's any reflections or reactions to that. I know we've been, you know, explaining a lot, so if there's any other questions or thoughts on this, we'd love to open it up. Yes. Should we get a mic to you?
Thank you very much, Rodney Taylor, Caribbean Telecommunications Union. And I joined this session late, so forgive me if you maybe answered this question before. But when I arrived, you were talking about data localization, and I want to link that with data sovereignty as well, in particular because we advise governments on policy, right? ICT policy in the Caribbean. And for us as in the Caribbean, a small island developing state, so much of this infrastructure, certainly cloud services are based in developed countries, you know, AWSs and Azure, United States, Europe. And for us, we are pushing, of course, digitalization, things like civil registry information, my birth certificates, medical records, criminal records. And so from us, from our perspective, there's an issue with having that kind of data outside of my jurisdiction, not just from a national security point of view, but certainly most of our islands are connected to these clouds via subsea fiber cables, and if there's a disruption to that, then does it mean that my government service is shut down? I'm no longer able to access my civil registry. So we understand the value of having data externally from a resiliency point of view and so on. But what have your studies shown, or what is this a real concern for us, small island developing states, or is this, and how do we address that? Let me put it that way. Thank you.
So I think I'd be best sort of situated to answer that question at a principle level and not so much at a diagnostic, like what should you do. I think that whether it's a real concern or a well-founded concern or not is irrelevant, because it is something that all countries are thinking about, so we have to sort of contend with it. I think the larger question, or sort of this is what our approach, at least in studying non-personal data, has been, is to look at regulations, including on data localization, on standardizations, and how you're even thinking to the future of a country's data governance, is to think about the ecosystem as a whole and see sort of per jurisdiction, what does it take to create data regulation that can be layered, that can evolve over time, that can not necessarily pivot from one end of the spectrum to the other on matters like data sovereignty, but be able to sort of dynamically evolve with what we learn going forward. So that's also work that I can share with you, because we've done a sort of a scan of, and this was last year, but of countries and how they're going about their, at a principal level, what does data sharing look like to different countries. And based on our analysis of where most of the benefits lie, we saw neither, and even at the level of the country itself, neither a mandatory nor a voluntary data sharing mechanism, but one that enables the ecosystem as a whole. So incentivizing and sort of injecting these enablers through regulation into the digital ecosystem. So that also, I think the key is that it allows for room to develop and room to make changes, for regulation to be fluid, which is not something that we've required in the past, but with a field like data and something that changes so dynamically, we're seeing that should be sort of the orientation for most policymakers.
I was wondering if I could add something towards, because that data localization is something that we have worked a lot on. I'm Natalia from TBI, Tony Blair Institute, and as part of our data governance, we have been analyzing the benefits and hindrances that data localization measures can cause. And what we have perhaps seen is that it's important for countries to try and do data classification. So there are certain data that is too sensitive to share or to even stored abroad, especially with the US Cloud Act or the power. Well, you have either US technologies in cloud bases or China, which also has its problems of government use of data. So with that data classification, then we have been able to try and show countries how they can classify their data, and depending on that data classification, then take decisions on where to store it, either public clouds or physical data centers that are not linked to the cloud. But also something that we have found very interesting is, for instance, most countries consider health data very, very sensitive, so they restrict the processing and storing of data to their own borders. However, we have found that this hampers health research enormously, and health data that is anonymized doesn't work. It's useless for research. So there needs to be room for exceptions, as it was, for instance, when it happened with COVID-19, that there was an exception to this extreme protections over health data to benefit research and to benefit public safety and public health. And if I may, just one final thing, what we have also found is the importance of governments on trying to understand how they can collaborate within certain priority areas that they have within their own region or with other countries, so that they can work on sharing and or storing data in certain countries. And just one final thing, what we really try and advocate against is for blanket regulations. So some countries have chosen to put in their data protection laws that no data, regardless of what sector it becomes, can be stored or processed abroad. That's what we think is very harmful. You need to classify and determine those things depending on what type of data that is. But very happy to share our research findings. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you for that intervention. That was super useful, and I think we're seeing that play out in the Indian policy landscape as well. But I think we struggle to sort of identify what those segments for classification are, and we ran into that with our non-personal data governance framework, where it's sometimes hard to distinguish between, especially also what non-personal data is, even after it's been de-identified. There's still harms and risks that make it sensitive to be shared externally. So I think as we think about classification, it also varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So it's fascinating. We'd love to hear about your study and see if we can make it a part of the resources that we share with the participants today. That'd be fantastic. Yes,
okay.
Please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is related to, besides the paradox of data sovereignty, there is the issue of even locally the data privacy issue versus the security or the national security platform that interferes to personal data issues. So data can be taken if the giant guys can if they do want to take, they can take it. There is no the issue of privacy. So where is the clear demarcation, even in not only in Africa or in developing countries, even in the US, any security institutions can take private data behind the door. So where is the clear how can resolve, how may, as an individual, maybe protected my data? So how can we trust even the collected data of mine to be protected? Thank you very much.
I want to start out by saying there's not a great answer to this one, because I think we're dealing with it in this moment. In fact, we've seen it most recently with sort of the Indian privacy regulations that have been developed as we speak, in some ways, where there is this tension between data for national security purposes and what backdoors the government wants to sort of install in these legislations. And it makes it increasingly hard for us as citizens to have the collective power or ability to push against against that. I wonder whether there's room for us to think about, and I think this is kind of the work we've been doing around stewardship, to think about how we can interact with smaller intermediary organizations. I think that's where stewardship has come in. So I think dealing with the sort of policy level questions are definitely complex, and I don't think we have a good answer. But I think the context in which we see stewardship is really at more of an individual or collective level, where we're engaging with organizations that probably have a lot of sensitive data on us, even if it's an NGO, right? So this is the reason we talked a lot about nonprofits, collectives that are capturing a lot of our information. So are there organizational principles that these smaller organizations, the data holders themselves, can start to institute? So even if we are left without a sort of privacy regulation or piece of legislation that is working in our favor, can we advocate, or can we have organizations that are advocating on our behalf? So we face this in India, where we said we don't have a privacy bill. What do we do in that case? Or if we do have a bill, it's favoring one player over the other. So how do we kind of go forward? How do we proceed? So data stewardship in some ways has been our workaround, or our way of thinking about a workaround at that level, because we don't have the sort of necessary power in other cases to sort of respond against that, or to so we see stewards as sort of like bulwarks, as these intermediaries that can push back to some extent, but again, I think this is an open discussion. We'll have to see how it evolves in our developing countries as well as in the developed world. I think even with GDPR, this is a bit of a concern today as well. So we're not seeing that other parts of the world have figured it out either. But would you guys like to add?
I mean, I would just, sorry?
Sorry. I think that your question also responds to why we have are studying data stewardship, because we've recognized that different people have different needs. And so when you convene and like come up with these communities and like this cooperative or like collaborations, you serve your needs. So you contribute your data and say that I want I want this, I don't know, whatever value or whatever you want to, what value you want from that to come. So it's like having like frameworks on a national level assumes that everyone wants to participate. It's kind of like facilitating like forced participation, and it doesn't consider the fact that different individuals have different needs, and so we want to start thinking about the fact that people have different needs, and that if this one system doesn't serve your need and you want your data to be protected from there, you don't have you have the right to not participate. I mean, I think overall we don't have the framework or how it looked like on a national level or on a continental level, or like Protect, for instance, where yes, you may be having this I don't know data system or data set that does have value or does contribute to some sort of like objective for a community, but then it's like most of the value goes into these international organizations. It doesn't deal with that, but I think we want to also like really break it down towards like these little communities and realize that it's yes data, but it's like it's data for a specific person, and like we all don't have the same needs, and therefore it should look at that. That's all I want to say.
I think one more question. Do we have one? Yeah, after that.
Thank you for raising this issue. I think data stewardship, actually, as raised earlier by different participants, it has a different way of concepting what data stewardship from government national perspective, or it could be at organizational perspective or sectoral perspective. They may define it in a way. Mainly, as to my understanding so far, responsibility for handling, controlling, sharing data from national or institutional or sectoral perspective. That is a way data stewardship is mainly be used. Now, as I conceived your thought, and from the case study that you have presented earlier, it is from a human perspective, as an individual, or when an individual be a member, a part of a community. Now, the question that raised to my mind is that, yes, governments may own some kind of data, organizations may own some kind of data. Now, there is a very basic issue. Can an individual, as a human being, may own data? Individual data ownership, is there such a concept?
then again, this kind of ownership as a community level. Individuals, when you belong to one or more individual communities, taking your 4 or 5 case studies, I may belong to different communities. So as a community, is there a concept of data ownership? And another perspective relating to this one is, usually governments in a legal perspective, they define the right to access data. The right to access data, as an individual, I have a right to access my own data, my personal data, and any data collected from my part by anyone, from the government, from any other ones, that may belong to my property as a right. So how do I access it, using what kind of platform, and how do we share with other ones? I think that is the perspective we are trying to highlight and advocate in data stewardship from a human perspective. So it's better to correlate and see the difference of different concepts that we are using in data governance and how it's related with data stewardship from different perspectives, and how it differs from the other one. And also, it's better to link with also data ownership at individual and community level. Thank you.
I'll keep it brief because I know we're almost at time. But I think on data ownership, it's always been sort of a controversial way of thinking about data, because likening something that is basically an extension of our human self to property, I think especially from the legal lens comes, and from the ethical lens also, comes with a few outcomes that I'm not sure most governments or broadly, thinkers around data rights are ready to, or would be in support of viewing data as property. But one area where this thinking has in some way been applied or been sort of tested is in data trust, where the sort of common law conception of trust is transported to a data layer. But even in that case, typically data trusts have been envisioned as where the rights, where data rights are the sort of center hold of the trust, and there's no actual, there's no sort of signing off of data as a property. And I will also sort of caveat that by saying that in our research on data trust, which has been extensive so far, we find that that's a model that only really works in common law countries, which are very few in the world, and even then it reflects a more top-down management of data rather than something that enables, like you said, the human participation and that center. So the way we envision data stewardship is not around ownership for exactly that reason, is so that we don't view it as property, but we view it as something that that requires collective negotiation, that requires meaningful participation. Maybe, okay, I was going to say.
I was just going to qualify that to say as well, I think the ownership from like an individual lens kind of precludes the ability for us to have collective value over data. So data can't just be used by one person and then it's done, I think we see data can be used by that one person potentially, but then also for another use possibly, so for a community use. And also many instances there's data that may not be sort of attributed to one person, maybe attributed to the community, and has value for multiple community members. So for instance, the data that could be generated by a sensor in your backyard and deals with air pollution doesn't just belong to you as an individual that has access to a sensor, but may belong to the community or the residential area in which you inhabit. So I think the reason we've stayed away from the sort of data ownership lens or the individual-centric lens is that it kind of I think it avoids the possibility of us having multiple or secondary uses over that data, whether it's for research, whether it's for innovation. And I think also that there's a lot of data, the value of it can remain kind of hidden unless we share it, So in some instances, yes, you absolutely want to keep your data private and you should have sovereignty over it. And we've seen that concept emerges very clearly in the sort of indigenous data sovereignty movement. And that's another thread that's actually very well tied to data stewardship. And in that context, has certain principles where the indigenous community has complete control over whether they want to share data or not, because any data that's shared may, be used in ways that could harm that community or set of individuals that belong to the community. So there's some instances where data ownership comes up, but I think it's tricky, especially when you can't separate data points or individual data points from a larger set, for instance. It fails to sort of consider the sort of larger collective value around data, the secondary reuse of that data. So I think it definitely comes up in our discussions, but we stay away from it because it's super loaded as a term conceptually and also how it's been applied. And the last thing I'll say is that it tends to be the sort of immediate thread that comes from data ownership is, okay, how can you then monetize that data? It becomes like a really easy pipeline to the monetization question. And I think there may be value around data monetization. We're not saying that that's not the case, but I think a lot of what we've tried to highlight is also the non-economic use of that data for individuals and communities as well. That could be collective in nature as well. So I think that's kind of just the approach that we've been thinking about a little bit more. But sorry.
I was going to add the point on monetization, but yeah, like you said, our colleague Roland, who wasn't able to join us completely virtually and help talk through the work, is now on the call. Yeah. So maybe we can hand over to him for just some closing comments and just to close out the session, and we can of course take this offline with everyone else who's participated. Which one? Roland, we
We will share the resources after this presentation that really provide links to the work that we have done around data stewardship and encourage further interaction, any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Roland. I think we got some of that in the caption, but the last bit was audible. Do you want to quickly just let everyone know about?
All right, so we mentioned resources, as did Roland. So we mentioned very briefly that we were working on a playbook. Sorry, just the next slides. The clicker? Okay, so we have a playbook that we've been working on. So we talked about shared responsibilities, the fact that data stewardship needs ecosystem support, and multiple different layers need to be considered if stewardship were to be put into practice. So APTI has been putting together a playbook to deal with strategies and action items that everyday stakeholders can actually take. So we have 4 plays that we've put together, one on what the public sector can do to sort of instantiate participation, one on how we think about stewards at a sort of funding and sort of sustainability perspective. So how can these remain objective entities that are not just monetizing data or extracting data? How can they be really responsible entities that are, funded and sustainably funded? The other that looks at actual technical mechanisms around participation, right? So we talked about it at a sociological level, at a data justice level. How do we start to infuse this into the technical architecture is one of the plays that we look at. And then the last is we look at actual sort of public sector institutional mechanisms, right? So many of us in the room today are thinking about how to frame this at an institutional level, at a policy level, at a state level. So how do we start to think about participation at scale and by sort of public sector officials, what needs to happen to sort of push the envelope further down the line. So we wanted to make this playbook available and accessible to you, and we would love to do so if you would be able to share your emails or with us, or if you have cards, and to sort of keep this conversation going. This is something that is very much in the works, and we hope to use the contributions from the room today to also inform a lot of what we have put down in the playbook, and keep this as a dynamic resource. We are public research organizations, so very much want to keep this as accessible as possible. So if you don't mind sharing your details with us, we'll take it down, or sharing your cards with us. We'll email you with the copy of the playbook, as well as this deck of resources that we've sort of pointed to throughout the presentation. I wanted to also thank Roland. I know he wasn't able to come in earlier, and thank you for your patience today. This was really a fascinating discussion. Thank you for all of your questions. But please do stay in touch. We're really keen to sort of keep this conversation going. We didn't have all the answers, but I think this is something we can collaboratively shape answers together. So thank you once again. Really appreciated all of you being here today. So we have a document that we're running for emails. If you'd like to put down your email. To share our cards, we have our emails on them, as well as details of the project.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this. Do you have a card? You know what I wanted to